Hey Research Stat 1 class, this is Stephanie and I am coming at you with our first video for the semester. Welcome to the class. Today we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about why are you even taking this class, right? And then we are going to talk about ethics, the ethics in psychology. So let's start off first with why are you taking this course? So I know that when I was an undergrad student taking what at UTSA is called experimental psychology. It's the same basic course. I had heard all kinds of horror stories. I had heard it's a weed out class and it's hard and it's horrible. And so I went into that class terrified, and I sat in it for the first probably 2 weeks terrified. And by the third week, I was thinking, okay, this doesn't feel as bad as I've heard it was going to be. And by the fourth week, I was really enjoying the class. And by the sixth week, I thought, okay, something's wrong with me because I love this stuff. This is awesome. This is why I had changed my major to psychology from civil engineering, because I love the science of psychology. So I absolutely loved my research stat class, my experimental psychology class. So every semester, true story, I've taught this class now for, 3 or 4 years, I think, here at A&M. And I taught actually experimental psychology at UTSA for 7 years. I love teaching this class. And so I always have students who by the first couple weeks, they're like, it's weird. I really am enjoying this. And I'm like, I know. It happens. I don't expect every student to fall in love with this class, but regardless of how you feel, if you fall in love with it like I did, my master's degree is actually in experimental psychology, because I love this topic. I love this stuff. I love research. I love the science and the math that happens behind psychology. And so I don't expect everyone to fall in love with it, but my goal for every student is that you see the value in this class, because this class is about research. And without research, we do not have a science of psychology. And we'll actually talk more about this in the next video, where we talk about the scientific method and things like that. But the book kind of starts off with this really interesting discussion of why are you taking this class, right? Because left to their own devices, most students actually would probably not register for the class. And I have to be honest, I don't think I would have registered for this class as an undergrad unless I had been forced to take it from my degree plan. But it is an important class. Like I said, it's a foundational class. So this class is actually a little bit different probably than any other class you've really ever taken before, because this class is what we call a process class. It's not a content class. And what that means for you is that instead of learning about theories and having things to memorize that come out of those theories, you are learning the process by which we create those theories. You are learning the process by which the science of psychology happens. And so that sets up every future class you ever take. That's the main reason that a research and statistics class is kind of a gateway class. Until you take it, there are a number of other psychology classes that you are not allowed to take, because you won't have the background to fully understand the research that you're being exposed to. So in that way, process classes are incredibly important. So I want to tell you a little bit about the science of psychology and why you might not right now think about psychology as a science, right? I love science. I love math. And when I first started at university, I was a civil engineering major. And the only thing, this is a true story, it's funny to me still today, the only thing I knew I did not want to be when I grew up was a psychologist. I would have bet everything I had, including my children, that I would never go into psychology. I just loathed the field because of everything I had learned about it. And when I say everything I had learned about it, what I had learned about it was Freud. And that was it. I had taken a European history course in high school, and we learned about Freud. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a bunch of hooey. Ugh. I wouldn't want to do that for a living. And so for me, psychology was something that I knew I was not interested in. And I had a horrible experience where I got dropped from all my engineering classes because I could not afford to pay for them, and ended up taking a psychology class that semester. Introduction to psychology, and I absolutely fell in love with the science of psychology, because it is a science. The way we learn about people is by studying them, and we implement the scientific method in order to do that. So I'm going to talk really quickly about what you know about science, and why I think for many people psychology isn't one of the first things they think of when they think about science. And I hope that that changes for you at least a little bit this semester. Maybe will be like the third or fourth thing you think of when you think of science. I'm okay with that. So you've heard of hard sciences versus soft sciences, right? So hard science is something like chemistry or physics. Students often think that it's called a hard science because they're hard courses, or a lot of students have difficulties in those courses, but that's not why. A hard science employs the scientific method to uncover information, and hard sciences like physics and like chemistry are lucky in that they are able to do things like create laws that work. Every time you pour fresh vinegar into fresh baking soda, it causes a reaction, right? And that works every single time because those compounds are the same, whether I buy that vinegar at H-E-B or whether I buy it at Trader Joe's. Vinegar, right? 5% acidic vinegar is vinegar. It's 5% acidic, so it's going to always react the same way as long as it's fresh. And that baking soda is a similar thing, right? It has the same compounds in it no matter where I buy it. So hard sciences have these, I guess you can think about them as kind of like being benefits that make the hard sciences kind of beautiful, because every time they test something, it works. And that is certainly something that we don't have in psychology, right? No two people are alike. No two people, it's worse than that, right? We don't just have the problem that people are not the same. You might not be the same right now versus in 2 hours, right? We have moods, right? We have additional issues. If the weather is bad, we might not feel as happy as we would if the weather was better. Right now, some of us might be worrying about people who we love who live near Houston and Beaumont, and we know that there's a hurricane heading there today as I'm taping this. And so, that idea that we are a science, but we test something very different than the other hard sciences, because we're testing people and no two people are the same. That creates potentially issues for us. Some people argue that means that psychology cannot possibly be a science, but I vehemently disagree with that. On a number of levels, but my basic argument of that is that it doesn't mean we cannot be a science, but it does mean this: in order for us to be a serious science, we must be an even more rigorous science than some of the hard sciences, because there are a lot of things that aren't going to affect that vinegar and baking soda reaction, right? Things like the temperature in the room, the noise level in the room. There's so many different things that are, right? The shape of the container, so many things that are not going to affect that reaction, but that might affect people if we were doing an experiment with people. So things like the temperature in the room affect people. Things like the lighting in the room, that affects people, the crowdedness, all kinds of things. So we have to be more rigorous in our scientific method. It's not that we're not scientists, it's that we have to be the best scientists. We have to create opportunities for ourselves to be rigorous in our use of the scientific method. So some people say, well, you have these difficulties, so you're definitely not a hard science, you're soft science. My other degree is in anthropology, and anthropology is definitely a soft science. My argument would be we're not a soft science. Soft sciences, like the social sciences, typically speaking, don't employ the scientific method. When they do, it's sparse. And in general, they do a lot of what we call quantitative research versus qualitative research. So they create more narrative kind of research. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love doing that kind of stuff too. But it's certainly not hard science. The problem is this: what we do in psychology is different than what most other social sciences do. We're not creating narratives. We are employing the scientific method, and we are using the scientific method to uncover the things that make us human, the human universals that seem to apply to most people in most times and most places. So we're not a soft science, okay? We're not hard science, so where are we? Many years ago, I had a professor who said that that must make us a medium science. And at the time, I was a really shy student. I didn't say anything, but I was so annoyed with that. And so I have a different saying. I say that psychology is the hardest science. Because if you really think about what psychology must do in order to be a science, we must have significantly more control than some of the hard sciences even. So when we want to experiment on a group of people, we have to consider every single possible extraneous variable. And if you don't know what that means yet, you will in a couple of weeks. But we must control every single possible extraneous variable. We must really do our best to be rigorous in our employment of the scientific method. So again, to me, psychology is the hardest science. At this university, at A&M San Antonio, we are actually part of the Department of Life Sciences. Now, that's a change, right? We used to be part of the Department of Science and Mathematics. That department is now splitting because it's gotten too big. We're growing pretty quickly here, which is awesome. And so we are now part of the Department of Life Sciences, along with biology and industrial health. So this Department of Life Sciences, right, includes these three disciplines. Psychology, industrial health, and biology are all beautifully entwined. And so there's lots of opportunities for us to conduct research across those three disciplines. So I'm excited that we've been split in this way. That said, I want you to notice we're not part of the social sciences. There is a Department of Social Sciences at this university that we do not belong to because we are not a soft science like the social sciences. We are a hard science, just like biology, just like industrial health. So I want you to recognize how important it is, how important science is to psychology. If you have never learned the definition of psychology, you've got to do it, like literally right now today. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and the mind. And that idea of science then is embedded in the definition of psychology. It's that important to us. So make sure that you recognize that psychology is a science. So you are taking this course because psychology is a science. You need to understand the process then by which we conduct scientific inquiries in the discipline of psychology. So this is a process course. It is different than the other courses that you've taken. When you take social psych and personality and all these other courses, you're learning foundational theory, which is very important. But the way we get to foundational theory is through research. And so the goal of this class is to teach you about that research process. We're not learning about theories in this class. We are learning how to create theory. We are learning how to establish the science behind the theories. And so this course is actually incredibly important in that way. Something else that I hope that you'll get out of this course is how to be a good consumer of scientific information. You are constantly bombarded with scientific information, and that is especially true lately with the COVID-19 information, right? Everyone thinks they're an expert on masks. Everyone thinks they're an expert on medications and the vaccine and everything else. But you need to be able to look with a critical eye at the information that you're being told and evaluate it. You shouldn't be satisfied with a meme, right? If you see a meme, the next step should be, let me go see what the foundation of this meme is so that I can understand where it's coming from. And you may agree or disagree with it, but at least you've educated yourself, right? And so having that critical eye as you're looking at information is incredibly important. All right. So one of the last things I want to say about taking this course is that it is required for most graduate programs that you do well in your research stat course. In fact, approximately 85% of clinical psychology graduate programs are looking for you to have taken and excelled in a research stat program as an undergraduate. The programs are known to be, the classes are known to be rigorous, which is one reason, but also there is no clinical psychology without research. So research underlies everything we do in psychology, and this is an incredibly important class. Hopefully this semester you're going to develop that critical eye for science and just kind of develop your critical thinking skills in general. We have a couple of exercises that we'll do throughout the semester to kind of help you start thinking critically about information. So the book talks about critical thinking, and I love that they do it in this first chapter because it kind of frames the rest of the class for you in terms of framing it for you so that you know that you need to be critically evaluating things. So critical thinking is an active process. It's actually not something that most people do automatically. Critical thinking takes cognitive energy, and your brain likes to conserve cognitive energy. And so it often prefers to just take things at face value. It's why when you see the meme, you're like, oh, I totally agree with that based on whoever said it, as opposed to thinking, okay, I don't really care who said it. Does this make sense or does this not make sense? Let me go investigate it further, right? Look at how much energy it took to just think about that as opposed to saying, oh yeah, cool. I agree with that person who said it most of the time, so it must be a good meme, right? But how often do you do those kind of things? So critical thinking is active, and for many of us, we have to force ourselves to do it. And that said, one of the cool things about critical thinking is it can become a habit that you get into. So the more you practice critical thinking skills, the more you kind of trigger yourself to do critical thinking when you're posed with opportunities to do it. Critical thinking also is a careful analysis based on your current knowledge. So one of the things I find to be fascinating nowadays is that, we have these incredible phones, right? These incredible phones that have all kinds of information on them. Literally, if you had told me 15 years ago that I could carry something in my purse that had the answer to every question I would ever have, I would have thought you were crazy. But smartphones, literally, right? You can go to Google, you can research stuff, and it's incredible to me how few people actually do that. You have the power to do it. You don't choose to do it. But I want to encourage you to start thinking about, where's the information coming from? How can I find more? You have to think about other things as you're introduced to new information, right? You need to think about your personal biases. This is a big issue actually when we talk about ethics in psychology. Being aware of your personal biases is incredibly important across most of what we do in psychology. And it should be something that we're aware of in our everyday life. Don't discount things necessarily just because of where they come from, right? I hear this all the time. I have friends on both sides of the political aisle, and I constantly have people who say, oh, you shouldn't listen to that, that's MSNBC, or oh, you shouldn't listen to that, that's Fox News. Don't discount information because of where it's coming from, critically evaluate it, right? If it's coming from a source, there are probably other sources that have the same or similar information. You need to go to all those different sources, right? That's part of critical thinking. So critical thinking is work. It's a process. It's active. And throughout the semester, I'm going to encourage you to be practicing more and more of your critical thinking skills. All right. So this week, what you have due is some information about ethics, right? There's a blog that I've asked you to complete. I've got some blurbs. They're a little bit longer than a blurb, but some short information about some studies that really have been conducted in psychology. And what I want you to do is to critically evaluate them using the information that you receive about ethics. So this book is not a psychology book, right? This is a social science. It's research in the social sciences. And it's appropriate for us because we are doing some social science research. However, it's not a psychology book. And so you're going to find throughout the semester that I add quite a bit, especially to these first 4 chapters. I add a lot to the book because I don't believe it to be sufficient for psychology. So here, almost all of this ethics information is not contained in your book. So you're getting it from lecture. And then you're also getting it from the links that I have for you within the PowerPoint for the APA website. So one of the first things we have to think about when we think about ethics is how is ethics different than morality? So we have to be really careful because many times what we're really misconstruing ethics to be is morality, but those are 2 totally different questions. A question of ethics is what is appropriate given certain guidelines that we have. Morality is more personal based, often based in religion, things like that. The problem is that the 2 do go together. And so creating a ethical code is an incredibly complex and difficult task. We started working as a discipline on an ethics code after World War II. Psychology was becoming a more prominent profession. We had people who worked for the military in psychology. That was actually not that uncommon prior to the war. But after the war, we had more people going into private practice, things like that. Psychology as a field was evolving. And given the atrocities of World War II, the need for an ethics code became clear when we talk about research and just even professionally. So historically speaking, that the situations that happened in World War II with research that was done against people's will, research that was done that was disastrous, ended in death for some people, those kinds of things that were done by the Nazi regime, the world sort of took a stance and said never again, right? But the question is, how do you ensure never again? And as a country, we didn't necessarily have unification in terms of what that might look like. In fact, we won't get, as a country, unification on what ethics codes might look like until 1978 with the Belmont Report. But as a discipline, we recognized the need. And so there were actually very early on, two committees on ethics in the APA. The first one was actually headed by Edward Tolman. And those of you who have taken learning or intro to learning, or if you haven't taken it and you're going to take it soon, remember that name, Edward Tolman, right? We talk about him when I teach the class. So kind of interesting that he headed up the first ethics committee, but they actually didn't come to any conclusions. And so that committee was disbanded, and a second committee headed by Hobbes was formed. I think, I should have gone back and studied this a little bit. I believe Hobbes had 8 people on the committee, I can't remember if that included him or not, but there were 8 people on the Hobbs committee, and they were tasked with this seemingly impossible task to come up with a set of ethical guidelines for the discipline of psychology. Hobbs and his committee came up with this, what I think is a fantastic idea, to ask the members of the APA if they had ever seen an ethically questionable situation. So if you had, you were asked, what was the situation and why do you believe it was a problem ethically? And this is called the critical incidence technique. The critical incident technique is used in health. It's used in all kinds of things. But the use of it here to create an ethics code, to me, is particularly fascinating. So they get almost 2,000 responses. I think it's like between 16 and 1,800 responses. Some people, some APA members give more than one situation. What they learned from this is a couple of things. First of all, ethical dilemmas are not uncommon, right? We asked for ethical dilemmas and we got mail for days, right? We got 16 to 1,800 responses stating these are ethical dilemmas that I've witnessed or that I've been a part of, right? Because it's not necessarily just what you've witnessed. You may have been part of that as well. And again, some people sent in more than just one. And so I think the total number is right around 2,000 actual incidents that the committee went through. They categorize these incidents, and from those incidents, they create the APA ethical principles and our code of conduct. So in our PowerPoint notes, I have a link to the APA website where you can see the 5 general principles. And I need you to understand that these are incredibly important. You are going to be asked about these on the exam, so you actually really need to know them. So that is something that you actually need to study for the exam. So the 5 general principles are what you are going to use to complete that blog that I have posted for you for the week. So you're going to read the short studies that I have for you, the short blurbs of the different studies, and then you are going to evaluate the studies that I asked you to evaluate using these 5 general principles. So you actually need to study them because you're going to have to apply them, and you're going to have to support your assertions with what you learned from the APA general principles. As a general guideline, though, the 5 principles are these. So the first is beneficence versus non-malfeasance. The idea here, some people just call it do no harm, but it is bigger than do no harm. So that's the non-malfeasance part. But if you call it the do no harm principle, you're forgetting the first part, which is beneficence, because it's not just do no harm, it is do good as well. The research that you conduct should benefit the participant. It should not cost them more than it benefits them. You as a researcher have a responsibility to protect your participants from harm. So it's not just do no harm, it's bigger than that, and there's a responsibility behind it. So you should be conducting research that is well thought out, that is well planned, that is likely to answer the question that you have asked. Because we don't want to waste people's time. That also goes in with some of these other principles as well. So the second principle is fidelity and responsibility. So here the idea is that you have an obligation to be professional, to treat people as the professional that you are. There's this really interesting argument. Today we don't have it as much as we used to in the past. But, how much do these things, these principles reach into your personal life? It actually used to be the case that if you did something seen as negative within your family. So for example, you cheated on your spouse, you could actually lose your job because you had broken the principle of fidelity and responsibility. You were not acting in professional ways. And that was true whether it was related to your, whether the bad thing you did was related to your profession or not. Isn't that interesting? So fidelity and responsibility, you have a responsibility not just to yourself, and not just like for me, I have a responsibility to you all to present you with the most information, the most up-to-date information, the best information, the most honest information that I can. And so we all within the profession have various responsibilities. The third general principle is integrity. So integrity is the way I've written it for you guys, right? To be scrupulously honest, but that require it's that sounds easy, right? But actually having integrity is sometimes much harder than you might think, because it's not just being honest, but it requires self-evaluation as well. In order to truly have integrity, you have to be aware of your own personal biases. You have to be aware of what you are, how you kind of see the world, maybe how you might interpret things that are there or not there. So having integrity is a bigger task, I think, than most people sort of think it is. Another issue with integrity, for example, as a student, right, would be things like scholastic honesty and scholastic dishonesty, right? Academic integrity. And so, making sure that you're citing your sources every single time, right? If you have said the author, you need a citation. If you have said the article, you need a citation. If you said the book, right? If you had to look at a resource, cite that resource, right? If you had to look at a resource to cite that sentence or to write that sentence, cite the resource. Those are all components to academic integrity. Another issue with academic integrity is the issue of deception. In psychology, sometimes we do not completely reveal our motives our research motives to our participants in the beginning. And so deception is an issue that is tied to the ethical principle of integrity. So this week, as you are completing that blog and you're thinking, oh gosh, they didn't get informed consent, think about that in terms of integrity. The fourth general principle is the principle of justice. Your goal is to treat people fairly. And that is true whether you are a researcher, whether you are a clinician, any professional encounter that you have with any person should reflect the spirit of justice. And so, again, things like knowing your own biases become important here. If you have reason to suspect that you might not be able to work with somebody, either because of a personal bias, but also think about this, your own professional limits, then you have an obligation to be honest about that. And I think this is especially important, for example, today when we talk about things like counseling. I know it's difficult to be a counselor, especially if you're you have a master's degree and an LPC. So a lot of people have their own private businesses, and it may be very difficult to admit that you do not have the skill or the knowledge that you might need to help a particular person. But you have an ethical responsibility, right? Through all of these, if you think about it so far, beneficence, responsibility, integrity, and justice, to get that person the help that they need. And that may require you then to give them the name of someone else who's better equipped to help them. So justice is this really interesting thing because it's much bigger than it sounds when you first kind of look at it and read it. So I want you to think about that. Your ability to treat people fairly requires you to know a lot about yourself. And then the last principle is respect for people's rights and dignity. Here you have a job, you have a responsibility to safeguard people's rights, protect their rights of privacy and confidentiality. And so the 5 general principles are, like I said, they're incredibly important, and you must know these, right? Especially in the research stat class. This is an idea that we're going to see throughout this semester, so it's not just now. Make sure that you really study those general principles, and you really need to read through what the APA on the link I have for you in the PowerPoint, what the APA has to say. All of the information is there in that link for you. All right, so the general principles are kind of what guide us, but they are not the only information that we have. There are additional comments, there are additional thoughts on the APA guidelines, and so you can read the whole thing if you wanted to, but you don't have to. What I'm asking you to focus on, this is an introduction research class, right? So I just want you to focus on those 5 general principles and the rest of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. In terms of the document on the link, you don't have to do any more. All right, so the APA Code of Ethics comes out through the Hobbs Committee, and the last time we had a revision, a large-scale revision to the ethical principles was in 2002, and then in 2010 there were a number of amendments that were made. So 2010 is kind of the last big group of changes that have happened to that document. Within that larger document then, so it kind of starts off with the 5 general principles, and it has all these other additional guidelines as well. There are guidelines for research with humans, and that's what we are going to focus on for this class, because we are going to talk about research with humans. I don't discuss research with animals in this class. I know that some of you may be interested in doing that for a living. I think that's awesome if you are, but we're focusing on human research for this class. So one of the things that we said you had a responsibility to do, right, based on some of those general principles, is to have well thought out research. And that means that you have to really plan the research. It should be of high quality. It should be likely to uncover the information that you believe you're trying to uncover, if it's possible to do so. You need to identify any risk to your participants. You need to identify any benefits. You have to identify any potential for harm. So in creating research, I know that for me, when I was an undergraduate student, I thought research was really easy, because I was like, oh, I have all these awesome, I thought they were awesome ideas, right? I have all these awesome ideas that I want to research. And I never realized the amount of work that goes into actually creating a research project until I was in graduate school, creating research projects. It is incredibly intense and time intensive. Once you have a program of study going, it gets a little bit easier, but especially as you're starting your program of research, it's incredibly intense, because you have to think about all of those issues. Once you have created a viable study, and again, throughout the semester, we're going to talk about what that looks like, right? We are talking about that process. So we've got another 5 chapters that we're going to talk about where we learn to create a viable study. Once you have that viable study created, you're going to actually need to run it. And so one of the documents that you're going to provide for the people in your study is an informed consent form. So an informed consent form is given to participants usually before participation. And I say usually because in some naturalistic observation situations, you might present an informed consent form after the participant has been observed. If they decline participation, then you would not include their data. But like 99.9% of the time, the informed consent form comes before participation. And you'll notice that it says informed consent. It's not just a consent form, it's an informed consent form. And that means that one of the things that must happen is you must tell participants what they can expect from your study. What are they going to be asked to do? What are those potential risks? What are the potential benefits? All of that must be contained in the informed consent form. At most universities, they have kind of a stock informed consent form that has the basic information that must be on it, and then you as a researcher go in and fill in the details of your specific study for participants. In that basic outline that the university provides to you, usually it will talk about how long the participation will take. So participants need to know that. Any risks, any benefits, there's usually a section that discusses their rights as a participant. And one of the most misunderstood participant rights is that they may quit at any time without penalty. In some informed consent forms, what it says instead of penalty is prejudice. You may quit at any time without prejudice. And what this means is a couple of things. A participant has the right, if they are truly doing their best to participate but feel they cannot continue for whatever reason, they have the right to withdraw from the study. And if they have made a good faith effort to complete the study, they may even be entitled to some of the benefits, including class participation credit, and any additional compensation, for example, money or whatever that they were being offered. So that's a big issue, and we will talk about that a little bit more through the semester when we start talking about survey research and things like that. Let's see. Another issue is the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. Your book has a really great discussion on this. I hope that you will take a look at it. But you're in your informed consent form, you must assure your participants of their confidentiality, and then you have a responsibility to make sure that you truly keep their participation and their information confidential. Usually what will happen at the end of the consent form, there's a place for them to sign, and there's also contact information for the principal investigator, the PI. And so the person administering the study will sign it, the participant will sign it, and usually they get a copy of that informed consent form because it has the contact information. All right, so we've talked about informed consent, but I want you to think about this. Aren't there some people who maybe can't give informed consent? So think about this. If you wanted to work with a 9-month-old baby, could that baby give you informed consent? No, right? So we also have guidelines for what we call special populations. And this is anybody who cannot truly give informed consent. I think about babies, but when I think about informed consent, I also think about my Aunt Janie. My Aunt Janie had Down syndrome, and if she thought you were a good-looking man, she would give you consent to do all kinds of stuff to her. She had a very good-looking, or she thought he was very good-looking eye doctor, and he was getting assent from her, which is asking her if he could do the surgery on her, and she was like, yes, please do the surgery on me, right? Because she didn't care about anything. She didn't understand anything except for that he was a good-looking man. So consent is a real issue. And when we receive consent, there are rules about who's able to consent. The person must be over 18. They must have the cognitive capacity to be able to provide informed consent. And if any of those things are not, if the box isn't checked, then we have to do something different. For children and for disabled populations like my Aunt Janie, what we typically do is we get assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, assent from the participant, and we actually obtain the consent from their parent or guardian. So that's an important distinction, and you really do need to know that. So special populations, they may be able to give you assent, and you know, if we're talking about a 9-month-old baby, that baby cannot give you assent even, right? And so there are protections. We are a little more scrupulous about any research that involves a special population. So again, the child gives assent or the person with the disability might give assent, and their guardian or parent will give the consent to actually do the study. It's important to note that if a child refuses assent, then you do not conduct the study. That's a real issue. I've seen researchers try to kind of cajole a child into saying yes when the child is saying no. Ultimately, that is the job of the parent or guardian. But if the child is adamant that they don't want to be in your study, even though the parent has given consent, you do not have the right to move forward with this study. So that's an important thing. Another special population that we think about are people who are in institutions, and that can include state institutions like prison, like state hospitals, and you are in an institution of higher learning, right? So when we talk about institutions, we can even potentially be talking about college students. There's a lot of discussion about what consent looks like for college students who have to participate in research credits as part of their classwork. Here at A&M San Antonio, we have 2 classes that require you to participate in what we call the research experience component. Those are Gen Psych and then the psychology major class. In both those classes, you have a research experience component, but you don't have to do research to earn the credit. You can attend talks, you can read research, and so we have some opportunities outside of just participating in research for students who either can't do it or don't wish to do it or have ethical issues with participating in research. That said, again, there's a lot of discussion in the field, and has been for many, many years, about is it appropriate or proper to force students to be in research? Again, that's one reason why we don't do that here at this university. When we started accepting freshman level students, we put a lot of thought into how the research experience component would work, what it would look like, and that's why we have the additional opportunities for you to still get research experience, whether it's through reading research or going to scientific talks, or by actually participating in research. But that's because you are technically part of a special population. All right, so the book talks a little bit about the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. The IRB's job is to read through the research and decide if it meets the ethical standards of the institution. And so the way an IRB does that might be different across IRBs. I can tell you it is. I've worked with numerous IRBs. Some of them are really strict about things. Some of them are really lax. And so you have to really know what your IRB's standards are, what your institution's standards are, as you are creating your research. Some research is actually exempt from IRB review. So for example, this semester you and I are going to be doing a survey research. You're going to use each other as your participants, and because it's an in-class demonstration, there's no need for an IRB review. I look over it, I make sure it's ethical. It's because your classmates are going to be looking at it, and so I've had students suggest things in the past that are really invasive, and so we don't allow that in the class, but because it's class demonstration, it's exempted from any IRB review. Some research can get an expedited review, so if there's no risk to participants, oftentimes it can be expedited review, and if there are risks to participants, that would require a full IRB review. So risk should be kept to a minimum. Whatever risk your participants might be subject to, it is your job to identify those. And that's not always easy. It's one reason that sometimes we do a pilot study. A pilot study we'll talk about more, I think it's in chapter 3, but pilot studies are kind of pre-studies. We use a smaller sample size. We kind of test to see what's going on. Many years ago, I was part of a stress research group. And one of the things that we were doing, we were collecting saliva samples and sending them off to get analyzed for salivary immunoglobulin A, or SIGA. It's a lot easier to say that. And to get those saliva samples, people would have to spit in this vial. No big deal, right? Or is it? We didn't think it was a big deal. But what we found is actually really interesting. What we found is that a number of female participants were really bothered with having to spit in front of us. And our concern, of course, we were concerned because we don't want to cause anyone to be uncomfortable. But if you're stressed out at your baseline, that is increasing your SIGA way before it should be increased. So it's a problem for the study as well. So what we ended up doing is creating a little partition, and when we offered it to everyone, and whenever they had to spit, the partition was there. We actually had to put in an amendment with the IRB stating that we realized that embarrassment was a potential risk, and that to help alleviate embarrassment, we were offering this little partition. And a lot of women use that partition, much to our shock. But it was a real issue. It wasn't something we had come up with or thought of. It wasn't, nobody in any of the other research discussed this, but it was an issue. So be aware of that. You know, sometimes we miss what maybe should have been obvious. I'm not sure that should have been obvious, but we miss things like that. So risk is something that can be difficult to identify. So the last thing that we need to talk about in terms of ethics is the debriefing. And actually, before we get to that, let me talk very quickly about deception. I know I mentioned it when we were talking about the general principles, but you know, deception is something that for a lot of reasons in psychology, we sometimes have to use. If I told you exactly what I was looking for, you might act differently than you would normally act. And for that reason, we don't always tell participants everything in the consent form. So you have to tell them enough so that they can make a truly informed decision. And if you fail to tell them everything, then there's some deception potentially going on. And as we move through the semester, we'll talk more about this idea of deception, because again, if you knew everything about a study, you might not act normally. So the example I give you in the notes is Milgram. And I know that most of you have seen Milgram's study in your Gen Psych class. The Milgram obedience study basically was this: a participant would show up, and around the same time, another participant would show up, except one of those people was a real participant, and the other is what we call a confederate. A confederate is someone who works with the researcher and is playing a role within the study. So we have one real participant, we have one confederate show up. The person who is the real participant, imagine this. Imagine we said, okay, this other person is just going to play a role. Treat them however you would normally treat a person. Would that stop you from treating them however you would treat a person? Potentially, right? What happens in the Milgram study is that person who is the confederate is going to be a learner, and they are going to be hooked up to electrodes, and the other person, the real participant, is the teacher, and it is the teacher's job to shock the learner, an electric shock, every single time they miss a word in what they were supposed to have learned. If I told you, hey, that person's not a real participant, they're just acting like they are, treat them however you would treat a real participant, it might change the way you shock them. But in the Milgram study, it's even different than that, because this person looks like they're being hooked up to electrodes, but they're not actually ever going to get a real shock once the study starts. So what if I told you this? Don't worry about the person in the room. It looks like we hooked them up with to electrodes, but they're never going to get shocked. Treat them however you would normally treat them. Right? you wouldn't be able to act how you would normally act. Those are real issues for us then in psychology. So deception is sometimes necessary in order to get natural behavior. That said, different IRBs feel different ways about deception. Some are very open to it. Many of them are not. And so I posted some guidelines for deception for you in the notes. Make sure that you take a look at those. So the last thing I want to talk about really quickly is debriefing. So if you've used deception, there's a special type of debriefing that you're going to do called de-hoaxing. De-hoaxing is an opportunity to do a couple of things. So the first is see if the deception worked. So did the participant suspect anything? And then it's also your opportunity to come clean. When you are de-hoaxing, it's actually really important that you are honest with your participant unless telling the truth would do more harm. So if you chose someone on the basis of some negative characteristic, you may not need to tell them that. Again, that's a decision that the IRB and your department can help you make. A general debriefing, though, is always done after participation, and it should be done in a way that educates the participant about what they did, why they did it. It's an opportunity to clear up any misconceptions, address any negative effects of the study. It shouldn't be, and I have a real issue with this. A lot of times what debriefing looks like is, thanks for coming, and then you get handed a sheet of paper, and then the participant goes on their way. And there's actually one of the things I love is that psychologists study everything, right? So there was a group of psychologists who studied what happens to those papers, right? So if we just give students papers, what happens to them? They put a trash can near the door and found some like 60% of participants threw the paper away right away. So they left the room, there's a trash can, and they tossed it. And so, just giving people a paper is not a good way to debrief them. It should be bigger than that. You should try to educate the participant about what they did and why they did it, things like that. All right. So you can read the rest of the information that the book has about ethics. We'll talk more about ethics throughout the semester. Again, there's a reason it's in chapter 1, and it's because it's going to affect everything else we do for this semester as we learn how to create research. So I hope that you enjoyed this first video. Like I said, there will be another one coming out later this week that will discuss the scientific method and kind of finish up chapter 1 for you. If you have any questions after you've watched this and read the book, please feel free to email me. We can set up a meeting. We can email back and forth. We can talk on the phone. We can Zoom, whatever you need. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys.